from the 9 other fighters ranked below him in your top 10 at 140 pounds. The MGM Grand is the center of the boxing universe tonight, and for good reason. Still to come, undefeated knockout artist Giovanni Segura versus Cesar Cancilla at 108 pounds. If you haven't seen a 108-pound fight before, stay tuned. The activity can be amazing. And then the main event the boxing world has been anticipating for months, Miguel Cotto against Antonio Margarito. But before that, let's take a look at the next pay-per-view boxing event.
This Mexican Independence Day, Juan Manuel Marquez is back. Now he steps up in weight to face his toughest challenge, lightweight champion Joel Casamayor. Plus, the rematch of the year as Vernon Forrest seeks revenge against world champion contender superstar Sergio Mora. The challenge, Casamayor Marquez, Mora Forrest, Saturday, September 13th, live on pay-per-view. Contact your pay-per-view provider to order.
August 2, Boxing After Dark is back as welterweight Zab Judah and Josh Clottey battle with an eye toward the winner tonight. September 6th, more Boxing After Dark. Lightweights Juan Diaz and Michael Katsidas facing off, both coming off their first professional losses to high-activity many punch fighters. September 13 on HBO pay-per-view, Joel Casamayor meets Juan Manuel Marquez. For all that and more, log on to HBO.com. So 2 entertaining knockouts so far on the undercard of Miguel Cotto versus Antonio Margarito. Earlier we showed you Cotto relaxing in his dressing room and spoke about the time he had spent sitting at ringside. Here's Antonio Margarito, who entered the arena with a big smile on his face and is now beginning to lace on the boxing shoes and begin his own preparation for what is by far the biggest event so far in his career. Miguel Cotto has had the experience of fighting in Madison Square Garden before a record Madison Square Garden crowd, which he was instrumental in drawing last year against Zab Judah, and then later in the year against an almost equally large and passionate crowd in Madison Square Garden against Shane Mosley. So if there's any edge to be accorded to either fighter in terms of mastery of the big event, it is Cotto who has been there before. But nobody's wanted it more over the course of the past several years than Antonio Margarito. And as experienced as is Miguel Cotto, with a long amateur career and a trip to the Sydney Olympics prior to turning pro, Margarito has his own vast storehouse of experience, having turned pro at age 15 in Mexico and made it up the hard way without the guidance of a promoter or a matchmaker to see to it that he found all the right challenges along the way. And some may say that's the more difficult, perhaps in some ways the more rewarding path to stardom. Emmanuel Stewart, one subject on which I want to touch with you before we get a look at some Miguel Cotto highlights, and that's the question, very operative in Margarito's camp, as to how well Cotto takes a punch. There have been at least a couple of instances early in Cotto's career at 140 pounds where he was knocked down and hurt badly by Ricardo Torres. He was wobbled by DeMarcus Corley. Cotto's people say all that's ancient history now that he moved up to 147. Is it?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. You know, the fact that he's been knocked down, cut, staggered, that's one of the reasons I admire him so much. He's shown that he can take a beating and still not only survive, but come back and win fights. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of fans here admire a lot about him, too. At 147 with a big guy like, I say Margarito, one of the biggest welterweights out there. So, you know, he's a physically big guy, and he's always hitting you. He's hitting you on your shoulders, your elbows, on the top of the head, anywhere, and he wears you out. So it's going to be a big test. If he can take Margarito's punch tonight, and I feel that Margarito can take his punch, except that dangerous left hook to the body, which I think is Cotto's signature punch. And that's going to be a test tonight of whether Cotto can take the punch of Margarito, I think, as the fight goes on.
So Max Kellerman, if in fact Emmanuel's right, and the subject of whether Miguel Cotto can effectively take a punch has been put to rest, are the Margarito people whistling in the dark to think that Margarito's advantages in size and strength could be a determining factor in the fight?
No, I think he's obviously the biggest fighter physically Miguel Cotto's ever fought. And as we talk about Cotto's ability or inability at junior welterweight to take a great shot, was it weight drain? Can he now take a better one at welterweight? Antonio Margarito has demonstrated in recent fights especially that he takes a tremendous punch. He has quite a chin. But as Emmanuel just pointed out, he has a great chin. does he have a great rib? How are the ribs on the right side of his body? Because that is, in fact, Cotto's best punch, the left hook to the body.
Although in both of his last two fights, the left hook to the body was less prominent as a weapon than we had seen it before. And he was able to beat both Zab Judah and Shane Mosley more as a boxer than as a brutal slugger. Let's take a look now at Miguel Cotto's last three fights in the welterweight division and his ascension really to superstar status, starting with the Carlos Quintana fight, which was December of '06 in Atlantic City, New Jersey. There were some who thought the slick boxer Quintana was going to have all the answers against Miguel Cotto.
Well, Quintana was coming off a win against Julio, maybe the hottest prospect in boxing at the time. After this beating at the hands of Miguel Cotto, Quintana beat Paul Williams, who beat Antonio Margarito, maybe the top welterweight out there right now other than Cotto or Margarito. The way Cotto dispatched Quintana offered no resistance in spite of boxing as well as he could.
It was just a whipping, Emmanuel.
And you know, it's interesting, Margarito's last two fights ended up with him landing left hooks to the body.
There was Cotto.
That was his victory.
Burying Quintana with a left hook to the body. So then he took on the southpaw Zab Judah in Madison Square Garden, June 9 of last year, a date that Margarito had turned down with Miguel Cotto. Judah was actually the backup opponent, and many thought that Judah's hand speed would be too much for Cotto. In the early rounds, it looked as though that might be the case.
It looked like that, but you know, Cotto has proven that he's a consistent fighter who finds a way to win fights. He can beat guys who are faster than him by just grinding them down. And in some cases, he's actually got on his toes and outboxed guys. So that's one of the reasons that makes him such a favorite with the betting people here, because of his ability to make adjustments.
Cotto's not the first Puerto Rican superstar to have helped himself in a big fight with a conveniently situated low blow.
And the interesting thing about Cotto is not only is he not apologetic about it, he doesn't deny it. He says, I will do whatever I have to do in the ring. And no one seems to hold it against him, Jim, for whatever reason.
Well, Judah made a point of it at the end of the fight, but hardly had much of an argument given the way Miguel Cotto was able to beat Judah down from the fourth round on, even with blood springing from his mouth from a cut inside the mouth. It was the force of Cotto's will that seemed to suffocate Zab Judah.
And that's one of the things, he's did what he had to do to win. And he said for this fight tonight, whatever he has to do, he will do it. He really has no solid plan. He thinks he can start boxing, but he knows somewhere along the way a fight's going to break out, and he's prepared to stand toe-to-toe if he has to.
And as good as Judah is, as a former welterweight champion of the world, he isn't seen by ring experts to be as mentally strong as the next guy that Cotto would take on. Once the victory over Judah by knockout in the 11th round was secured, Cotto went on to a higher profile matchup later on in the year against Shane Mosley. The question at the start of the fight was, would the supreme boxer Mosley outbox the slower Miguel Cotto?
And in fact, Mosley is a tremendous athlete, but what Miguel Cotto showed throughout the fight, that it was that he was the boxer. His timing destroyed Shane Mosley's speed, which is no easy feat because Shane Mosley is super fast.
But
Mosley landed a lot of power punches.
I was going to say, also in this fight, though, it showed that Cotto gets hit quite easy a lot. And, you know, and Shane is not a real big super puncher. But if he cannot afford to get hit with the continuous right hands that he was getting hit with Shane Mosley by Margarito.
This was a seesaw battle. At the end of the evening, CompuBox numbers showed both fighters landing 248 punches. Mosley landed slightly more power punches. Cotto landed more jabs.
And also, one of the biggest weaknesses I've always thought with Cotto is shots up between the middle. Left uppercuts and right uppercuts, which Margarito does very well. Bringing punches up between the center, which is where Cotto gets hit at the most.
And the definition of what ultimately had happened in the fight was illustrated in the choices Cotto made in the late rounds, Max Gellerman.
Yes, sir. Cotto, until this point, had always been able to break his opponents. There's no breaking Sugar Shane Mosley. So Cotto decided instead just to beat him and outboxed him using his jab around the perimeter of the ring over the last two rounds.
Ultimately, it became a close, unanimous decision for Miguel Cotto, and despite how close the fight clearly had been, the gentleman, Shane Mosley, has never once made the suggestion that he was in some way robbed. In fact, he was quite foursquare in offering credit to the younger champion and saying, he beat me fair and square. That says a lot about Cotto. It says a lot about Mosley. 1 hour from now, we're going to learn a lot about Cotto again as he goes into the ring for perhaps the toughest challenge of his career against the violent and brutal Mexican welterweight star, Antonio Margarito. That'll take place about an hour from now. Meanwhile, we got one more fight on the undercard, and it could be a very entertaining one at 108 pounds. So let's take a look at the tail of the tape for Giovanni Segura against Cesar Canchilla. Segura, originally from Mexico, has lived the last several years in Bell, California. 26 years old, as is Canchilla, who lives in Barranquilla, Colombia, originally from a smaller coastal town in Colombia named Monteria. They're both 5 feet 4 inches tall. An arm length advantage of 1 inch for the Colombian fighter. Both weighed in at the division limit of 108 pounds. Both have rehydrated about 10 pounds overnight. Segura unofficially to 118, Canchilla unofficially to 117.